When I was growing up in Ohio, we had an orchard, about, 25, maybe 30 different trees. We had apple trees and sour cherry, sweet cherry, peach trees, pear trees, and several others. And it was about this time of year in Ohio, while it was still cold and the trees were dormant, that Dad would go down to the barn. He would gather up his pruning shears, the loppers as he called them, a little handheld tree saw, and once the trees got much bigger, he'd fire up the chainsaw to cut off the branches that had grown too big. Pruning. Now understand that when Dad started working doing this, that meant that my brothers and I started working as well. Because our job was to pick up the branches, the twigs, the sticks, the limbs that he cut, and carry them back to the burn pile. Oh, I hated that work. Bending over, picking them up, bending over, picking them up, carrying them back. I didn't care for it. But you know what? I loved the result. I loved the result. As the seasons progressed and we'd have a bounty of fruit to harvest, Mom's apple dumplings and cherry pies. But on the surface, when you think about it, pruning seems kind of radical, doesn't it? You're cutting stuff off of a live thing. Perfectly good parts of a tree or shrub or flowers, all to help it produce more. But pruning is also done to trim the excess, like cutting off a branch that has grown sideways and too large so that if it broke off, it might splinter and kill the rest of the tree. Sometimes pruning is trimming off some of the dead branches that died because they're harboring some kind of a disease, threatening the rest of the tree and maybe even the trees around it. Pruning is important to the new growth process. I have a Nellie Stevens holly tree right at the corner of my house. It's been there for 26 years, and I prune it 2 to 3 times a year, and it's full, it's lush, it's thick, looks like a Christmas tree. But I've got to keep it pruned, but it stays thick, and the leaves are just beautiful. Contrast that to the same Nellie Stevens holly trees planted about the same time that go down one line of our property that get trimmed once every 10 or 15 years, whether they need it or not. They're spindly, they're thin, they don't look as lush and thick or as nice. Let's say you wanted to grow your hair long, but the ends of your hair were split, they were frayed. So what do? You trim those ends, actually making your hair a little bit shorter so that it can grow longer. Maybe parenting involves pruning. We're being reminded of that now as we have a grandchild and trying to get that discipline down even at an early age. Disciplining, correcting, or even eliminating certain behaviors, it all helps our children grow. I know, sometimes it's painful, isn't it? And as long as things are growing, there needs to be pruning. But isn't our faith like that? Isn't our faith like that? You see, God, the master gardener, is working in us, through us daily, and God never gives up. As we return to the book of Hebrews and our sermon series, Don't Give Up, today we're going to talk about faith, stepping out in faith, not giving up on faith. It's been said that our Christian faith grows out of and is nurtured by the ongoing involvement that happens between us, the church, and this book, the Bible. The ongoing involvement that happens between us and the Bible. Not just something that we have or possess. Faith is like that. Faith is not just something that we have or possess. Faith is active. Faith is engaged. Faith is involved. Faith compels us, the church, to step out in action, to step out in acts of love and good deeds for others. For our faith to grow, we have to be constantly pruned so that new growth will emerge. The book of Hebrews, you see, invites us to stay actively engaged in our faith, to recall the story of our salvation history and to do something with it, not just hold it, possess it, put it on the shelf like a prized trophy to collect dust. Instead, we're called to stay connected Stay involved with this gift of faith as we are with the Bible by staying connected and involved with each other, with our faith, with the Bible. So let's begin our study of chapter 11 in the book of Hebrews. It begins this way. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. You see, faith involves human embrace. It involves human touch. It involves human tenacity, not complacency. It involves constant pruning. In these first two verses, our present lives are connected with our ancestors of faith, the people in the days of old, it said, the ones who lived by faith. So let's touch it, let's embrace it, let's hold it, this faith that is active. You see, the author of the book of Hebrews launches into a kind of roll call of the people of our ancestors in our salvation history who walked by faith. You know, in the Bible, when words are repeated, it's telling us to take notice. Well, in this chapter of Hebrews, those two words, by faith, are repeated about 18 times. Stand up, take notice, by faith. So this next section in chapter 11 talks about, moves from creation to Noah. So we're going to talk about some of the people between there. Verse 3. By faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. Faith, invisible. Yet we still believe. It is by faith that we attribute all that is to God. Let's go on. Verse 4. It is by faith that Abel brought a more acceptable offering to God than Cain did. And God showed his approval of those gifts. Although Abel is long dead, he still speaks to us by his example of faith. Next comes Enoch, the descendant of Abraham and an ancestor of Noah. It is by faith that Enoch was taken up to heaven without dying. For before he was taken up, he was known as a person who pleased God. And it is impossible to please God without faith. Think about that for a moment. It is impossible to please God without faith. You see, when we walk by faith, this incredible gift that comes from God, that's when we live in a way that pleases God, constantly pruning so that we walk by faith, trimming away the things that separate us from God and from one another. Verse 7. It was by faith that Noah built a large boat to save his family from the flood. He obeyed God. By his faith, Noah condemned the rest of the world, and he received the righteousness that comes by faith. I can't help but imagine the ridicule that Noah received. A flood? Really? Noah, you're a fool. An ark? What's an ark? Okay, first look around, Noah. You see where we live? It doesn't really rain here. Despite the ridicule, by faith, Noah obeys God and does what is asked of him. Let's move on to Abraham. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land that God would give him as his inheritance. He went without knowing where he was going. Abraham was confidently looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. Ever move to a different city, to a different state, to a different place, and you wonder what it's going to be like? How about if the company told you you were moving, but they didn't tell you where you were going? That'd be scary, wouldn't it? Kind of put a little kink in your shorts, wouldn't it? Kind of like riding up the tallest part of the roller coaster without knowing what it was going to be like once you crossed over the peak. You know, one of those tall roller coasters you see from miles away, and as you go up, clickety-clack, 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 you're just wondering, what's this going to be like? But you have faith in the designers of that ride and the maintenance people, and you know you're going to be okay. That's the kind of faith that Abraham and his wife Sarah had, stepping out in faith, trusting in God as they went up their roller coaster, clickety-clack, clickety-clack. And speaking of Sarah, it was by faith that even Sarah was able to have a child, though she was barren and was too old. She believed that God would keep his promise. Abraham and Sarah, having a child in the later years of their lives, they're walking by faith. And what happens when they trust? A whole nation came from this one man who was as good as dead. You know, if I was writing that, I think I would have been a little kinder and gentler. A nation with so many people that, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, there is no way to count them. So, what's the point of all these stories? What's the point of all these people who walked by faith, not by seeing? Well, we're told in verse 13, all these people died still believing that God had what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. They agreed that they were foreigners and nomads here on earth, resident aliens here on earth. We walk by faith because this is not our final destination. Ultimately, we will find a home, a heavenly home, where God has prepared a place for us and for all those who have walked by faith before us. Oh, we could go on. Hebrews mentions Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, Moses, the people of Israel, Rahab, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, all the prophets. And what do they all have in common, you ask? Good question. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back from the dead. Their weakness, you see, is turned to strength. They don't know exactly where they're going. They don't know how the rest of their stories will turn out. They don't know what's on the other side of the peak of that roller coaster, but they walk by faith. They step into action. They are pruned so that better things can happen for the glory of God. I know that many of us have had stories like theirs. Weaknesses turn to strength. And at other times in our struggles, we worry. We're clickety-clacking our way up to the peak, not knowing what's going to happen on the other side. We try to walk by faith, but the fears and the doubts, they creep in. We second-guess our decisions. We try to do it on our own without trusting God. We're like those little toddlers saying, I do it, I do it. Others are more like Abraham and say, if you tell me to go, Lord, I'll go. I'll pack up my bags and I will go. They are determined to walk by faith. There's a lady in our congregation right now who has recently received a diagnosis of incurable cancer. Treatable for a while, but incurable. With her permission, I'm sharing this. Judy is not so concerned about her own situation as long as the pain can be effectively managed. She's not exactly sure what the journey will be like, but her faith, is her faith strong. She is our pillar. She is our rock. She is our example. Her faith, like Abraham, Sarah, Abel, Enoch, Noah, and so many others, her faith helps her to embark upon this journey with God by her side. She walks by faith as a temporary foreigner, a resident alien on this earth, knowing that our God keeps his promises. She walks confidently, looking forward to a city with eternal foundations, a city designed and built by God. You see, we are reminded that life is not all cotton candy and flat roller coasters, John Deere tractors and bratwurst sandwiches on rye bread with Dijon mustard and lettuce and onion and Swiss cheese. I digress, sorry. Followed by apple dumpling. Even some of the most fruitful disciples of Christ suffered. Chapter 11, okay, here it is. Kids have gone out for the children's sermon, right? Which I forgot to announce. Here's the part. It doesn't end without suffering. But others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at, and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prison. Some died by stoning. Some were sawed in half, and others were killed by the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. You see, despite the risks, despite the challenges, despite the uncertainty of the road ahead, they all stepped out in faith. They were all willing to be pruned in some way in order to bear better fruit for God's kingdom. You see, all these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us. Just as God does for you and for me. A city with eternal foundations, designed and built by God. Knowing that God sends his Son, Jesus Christ, into this world, a world filled with bumps and turns and twists, cancer and struggle, sufferings and sometimes pain, Jesus goes to the cross and takes all those bumps, turns, twists, cancer, struggle, suffering, pain, to die with him on the cross, and then rises from the dead so that we too might live in that city with eternal foundations, a city where there is no pain, no more suffering, no more death. Therefore, as the traditional hymn tells us, have no fear, little flock. Have no fear, little flock. For the Father has chosen to give you the kingdom. Have no fear, little flock. Don't give up. Step out. Step out and walk by faith with God, this master gardener, at your side. Amen.